Yeah, it's a little.
Did you guys have this packet? With our problems on it?
Lab.
Cutting a little close, buddy. Yeah. Hours.
Oh.
Oh, so we've got 13. Who are we missing? Josh, Hannah.
Hey, right here.
Oh, why don't you kick them out of your seat? Riley, Josh. There's one more. There's 8 here.
Elaine.
Okay, 8 and 6, that's 14. Okay, so
Yeah. Oh, actually,
It was
you
nice.
left your pen on there.
That was broken. So there wasn't a test. But
It's not enough, right? I'll fix this. We got you good.
okay, I suppose we should get started. So lecture 16, your next question is due today. If you haven't turned in your third question, you can do that sometime today. So given the feedback I got from Professor Hayes, I get the feeling a lot of you don't know how to study. Because that feed ID was ridiculously easy, or at least it should have been. What's that?
That I was like, I wish we had a word bank.
What do you need a word bank for?
Process of elimination.
Not sure how that helps you, but it's too late to ask for that now. We can discuss that on exams moving forward. But I gave you a word bank from probably those 5 columns, right? High, medium, or low.
Yeah.
Forage, concentrate. That's all you really needed for that one column. Those are acceptable answers. Well, we'll find out. I'm trying to get all that stuff turned around as quickly as possible. I apologize for the delay on some of it, but that's probably the easiest test we have in this class. I got rid of all the hard ones. So perhaps there's a kind of lack of understanding about how to study. So if you haven't noticed, there are 3 review sessions scheduled for November 6th test on Monday nights. If you want to work on how you best study, I am available during those times. We can talk about what's on the exam, or we can talk about how to study. That's probably the biggest negative thing associated with your pandemic experience. If I sit here very still and don't move, I'll get marked present. Nobody will ask me any questions and I'll pass the course. That's not where we are in college. You need to participate. You need to be active. You need to work. So there's still a lot of points left in the class. There's no reason to feel panicked or anything like that. I think all grades are still mathematically possible. Just got to put in the effort. So announcements, we're going to start ration balancing on Thursday. Extra credit opportunities. We have an open house this Saturday. I don't know the schedule. Do you know the schedule? You're not going to be here, so you don't know the schedule. I think it's usually at 11. We use you to talk to the potential students, the student success seminars. Everybody's got that schedule. So your exam is the 6th, so 2 weeks from Wednesday. So effectively, you got 3 weeks to study. And we'll have review sessions tonight, next Monday, and the Monday after. You should all gotten a Teams invite for that. You can show up here in 102 and we can talk. I'm there from 5 to 8. Or you can show up on the Teams, check in, check out. Is there anybody that wants to come to the review session that can't make those any part of those blocks of time? 5 to 8 on Mondays. Okay, so Kirsten Kelly, you've got today. Okay. So we left off talking about carbohydrates, specifically starch, and how the rate of fermentation, the rate it produces acid in the rumen is influenced by surface area effects. So adding or subtracting water, grinding, changing the particle size, changing the genetics, all those things might be related. So now flipping over to the other side of the carbohydrate equation from non-fiber carbohydrates to NDF, we need to talk about effective or physically effective NDF. So depending on what school you're from, they'll either use effective, University of Wisconsin, physically effective is Michigan State. So the effective NDF is about keeping the butterfat levels up. Physically effective is about stimulating chewing. Or at least that's the hope. So the ability to stimulate chewing or maintain a balanced rumen. So the idea is the NDF is going to promote the cleaning of the rumen side, all those things we need NDF for to make a gut healthy. So stimulating scratch factor, stimulating rumination, stimulating contractions of the rumen, keep things mixing, keep things ruminating. When we ruminate, we increase the buffer flow to the rumen. So the rate of saliva secretion is twice that during rumination as it is during resting. So we get more buffer when we're ruminating, helping things there. So our physically effective NDF depends on particle size more than anything else. How big are the particles that go into that cow? And then you'd want bigger ones. Yep. If we pulverize the NDF, grind it up to nothing, it's not going to stimulate the rumen anymore. We want those long pointy ends that are going to scratch that rumen to keep it clean, scratch that rumen to stimulate rumination. Fermentability is going to have a factor involved with it. The faster that NDF ferments, the less it's going to be in a long particle state. It's going to disintegrate and not be scratch factor anymore. Has anybody here done dry matters with BMR corn silage? If you take BMR corn silage and dry it, it tends to disintegrate when you touch it. So we used to have big trays of stuff, measuring the dry matter stuff. You put your fingers across the top of that BMR, it just disintegrates. So the more fermentable it is, the less it's going to hold together, the less it's going to stimulate scratch on the side of that rumen. Fragility is sort of interrelated. Fermentability, higher fermentability usually means more fragile, less together. And lignin content. Lignin content is going to make it tougher. It's going to make it hold together longer. It's going to make it less fermentable. It's going to probably maintain that particle size. We think about lawn clippings. Whatever we got out here is going to ferment as NDF very quickly, disintegrate fast, disappear from the rumen. It's not going to scratch. At the other end of the spectrum, we're thinking about straw. Straw's got a high lignin content. It's tough. It's going to hurt your feet when you walk over it. It's not going to be fragile. It's going to stay there and stimulate more rumination in the gut there. So if we're looking at our physical or physically effective NDF or NDF, it's going to depend on those 4 factors we've already talked about. So particle size, decreased effectiveness when we have smaller particle size. We think about powder or any of that stuff we looked at in our feed ID. Distiller's grains, very small particle. Wheat mix, very small particle size. That NDF is not as effective as what we find with haylage. Straw. The particle size are much smaller. The bigger long stem hay, that used to be a standard recommendation for herds that had butterfat problems. Extension used to say, well, just bed them up real nice with straw. What are the cows doing in that case? Turning around and self-medicating by eating the straw. They're adding more long particles, a more effective NDF to their rumens, so they felt better. There's also cow comfort issues that we consider as well. But long stem is going to have more effectiveness than the powder associated with our byproduct NDFs. Fermentability. The higher the fermentability of a particular NDF, the lower the effectiveness of that NDF. We think about BMR versus conventional. Brown midrib is much more digestible, much more fragile, much more fermentable. That's not as effective as conventional corn silage. So the more lower the digestibility, the more effective that NDF is. Fragility. More fragile it is, the less effective it is. The less fragile it is, the more it holds together, more it maintains that ability to scrape or scratch the side of the rumen, the better the effectiveness of that NDF. Lignin, the less lignin you have, less effective it is. The more lignin you have, the more effective it is. So if you think about these 3 things are very much interrelated. So you might say that we got long stem straw over here as the example of something that's less fermentable, less fragile, has more lignin in it. Over here, you've got something like lawn, has very little lignin in it, it's very fragile, it's very fermentable when we talk about the NDF. Mm-hmm. 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 It might be connected to it. It's going to be harder to chop up something that's less fermentable, less fragile, has more lignin. It's going to require more horsepower to get that chopped up. Is that your question? Okay.
So would you feed them?
Do you need, and when we're balancing, the new way to balance for ration is making sure you have enough physically effective NDF in the diet. So you need 21% of the diet falls into that physically effective NDF. So we talk about forage NDF. Generally, we've figured it out. That's 100% effective NDF. So what's in corn silage, what's in haylage, what's in hay is considered 100% effective. But if we have a lot of byproducts in our feed, in our mix, we're going to discount that NDF. It's only going to be 25% effective or 0% effective on some of them, or 50% effective. So you're going to count all the forage NDF and you're going to count half of the byproduct or a quarter of the byproduct NDF, and all that's got to add up to 21% of the diet. So you're trying to get at that effectiveness by discounting for particle size. So anything you saw in those jars had very small particle size. Although once the alfalfa cubes rehydrate, they're going to have long particles in them. You've got the same chemical composition in our alfalfa cubes as we did with our ground alfalfa meal. They're both the same NDF content, could be. But the physically effectiveness of those alfalfa cubes or alfalfa hay is 100%. We're probably down with the alfalfa meal, we're down probably 0. Or 20% of the effectiveness. It's got slow fermentation properties. It's got some lignin in there that holds things together, but it's not going to scratch the rumen anymore. There's no scratch factor left once you pulverized it. Any other questions about this? So again, just like with the starch, we get it roughly right, and then we listen to our cows. Are they chewing the way they should? How are their feet? What is the production, the butter fat for these animals? We start with a ration we think is right. We give it to the cows, hopefully accurately, and they'll tell us whether or not, yes, this is a good ration for me. No, it's not. So we listen to their feedback. I'm not ruminating enough. You need to bump it up a little bit. I'm having trouble processing all this feed through. You got too much NDF. You can back it off a little bit. So how do we adjust there? Just wondering where that slide was. So how do we satisfy the needs? We take our NDF or pounds in the ration, assuming that she's got a certain amount of intake. We set the NDF to try to get that 15, 16, 17 pounds NDF in the rumen every day. That's going to form that structure in the rumen that's going to hold the small particles back. It's going to allow things to stay in the rumen long enough, particularly the NDF, to get digested, fermented, before it moves down the lower track. So how do we adjust? We're going to listen to our cows, and then we're going to check things. So if we've got a ration NDF, if I go right here in the middle, what % of the diet would be NDF? 30. So 28-30 is a standard ration for a lactating dairy cow. I can cheat down if I've got very effective NDF, or I'm going to have to cheat up in my total NDF if that NDF is less effective. So if I've got all long particle size for all my NDF, I'm not feeding any byproducts that have fiber in them, I can probably cheat down a little bit to get that 21% forage fiber NDF. If I'm feeding a lot of high fiber byproducts, I'm probably going to have to cheat up on my total ration amount of NDF because most of it is not effective coming from these high fiber byproducts. So it's sort of adding sort of like adding no effective NDF. So I'll slide up. If I have a TMR or I'm feeding grain many times a day as opposed to twice a day, that's going to promote a more balanced rumen. If I have a more balanced rumen, I can cheat down a little bit. Maybe get a little bit more starch in there, get a little bit more production. If I have a highly fermentable grain, we talk about pulverized high moisture corn. It's wet and the particle size is minuscule. That's going to hit the rumen. I want to have more NDF in the diet to counteract that. Something that's a little slower fermenting, something that's going to stimulate a little bit more chewing, get a little bit more buffer there to counteract that acid load with that highly fermentable grain. If I've got buffers and alkalizers, they're going to help stabilize the rumen. I could probably cheat down a little bit and still maintain a healthy rumen. If I have higher fiber digestibility, I'm going to need to cheat up. It's more fermentable, less fragile, or more fermentable, more fragile, less lignin. I need to cheat up to get the minimum amount of effective NDF into that cow. If I've got inadequate bunk space, all my cows can't eat at the same time, what's going to happen? Who's going to deliver new feed? Who's going to get there first? Mean cow, big cow, right? Who's going to get pushed out? Little timid cows, right? So they're going to be standing over the corner while the big strong cows are eating up front. If you're a little timid cow and you're constantly getting beat up, how are you going to eat? You're going to eat scraps in theory, or say the big cows get in there, they eat their big first meal over an hour, and then they all go lay down in the stalls. Now it's your turn as little timid cow. How are you going to eat? Fast. You're really hungry. You've been waiting extra hours. Your rumen's been emptying out. You're going to eat real fast and you're going to eat a whole lot. Does anybody know what that is called? It's called slug feeding. I can only get to, as I'm a little timid cow, and I can only get to the bunk now and again. When I get there, I hog down as much as I can. That's going to put a whole lot of feed into my rumen, and it's all going to start to ferment at once. You're going to have this tremendous acid load on that cow because the bacteria don't care. Hey, it's a party. We got lots of new feed. Let's go. You're going to have a big acid load, and for a short term, you're going to have acidosis. You're going to drop down below that pH 6 for a couple hours, and you're going to put a stress on that cow. So if we don't have adequate bunk space to protect those cows, we cheat up in NDF. If I can't mix the same way every day, one day I put in the right amount, next day I don't. On Christmas, I just put corn silage in and we dump that. There was a farm that couldn't figure out why the bunks were always empty after a holiday. The feeder went in, and every time the side of the mixer wagon called for something, just put in corn silage. It's gonna mess things up for 10 days. If you do the same feed every day, the cow's mutation rate of bacteria will make that bacterial population perfect in 10 days for that feed stuff in that cow. So if you got, some days I got too much corn silage, some days I'm not paying attention to my dry matters, it's raining, or like last Thursday, we just skipped doing the dry matters. We don't know what it is and we're not keeping track of things. You're going to be bouncing all over the place. we want to cheat up to protect our cows. We don't want to be right on the edge. So every other day we're going, boop, we're over the edge, we're over the edge, we're over the edge. We cheat up. So when we go back down, what's that going to cost us if we cheat up? Potential milk production. But we're saving our cows for long-term viability on our farm. So if we got adequate bunk space and no variation, we can cheat down a little bit, get a little bit more energy. Does everybody know how the feedlots work? What do they try to get those cows to do? Lots of little meals throughout the day. You don't want to slug feed on an 80% corn diet. They push up so much, they feed so much. They're trying to get 20 meals a day out of those cows. So every time there's any room in that, they try to put one more meal in that cow, one more meal. But it's 80% corn, which is ridiculously fermentable. If I put a standard lactating cow meal in there, that would blow up her rumen. So we want lots of little meals throughout the day. And that's why they never have an empty bunk in a feedlot. Never. Because then they'll all be slug feeding and you'll be treating them all for lactic acidosis and half of them are going to die. They're right on the edge of those cows all the time, but feeding management keeps them alive. No variation, adequate bunk space. They can all eat when they need to. Just starting to make sense. So a little bit more definitive there. Additional fat is going to get more energy in. Talk about the rate of digestion and passage. That's fermentability. Breaking things apart a little bit more, but focus on this one. Same stuff divided a little bit finer if you're interested. So when we're thinking about this, either a lack of NDF in the diet or too much starch, too much NSC leads to what? I've alluded to it. What do you got? First thing that happens is we get a decreased chewing. Usually rumination drops through the floor. I don't have the scratch factor to stimulate that rumination. Or if you're a beef cow, I don't even have any scratch factor at all. You got what? It's 80% corn, 20% corn silage, which is half corn. So you're looking at like 90% corn diets. There's not enough scratch factor. You can tip those cows over, and all their rumen contents will just run out of cannula. So it's just soup. But you're trying to keep that soup. So with a lack of chewing, we decrease the salivation rates across the day. We have less total salivary buffer secretion. This is based on studies that it seems that the buffer solution or the salivary concentration is the same no matter what's happening. Either she's just resting, salivary flow is the same concentration of buffer as when she's ruminating. So if I double the rate of secretion with rumination, I'm going to get double the buffer. So less chewing, less buffer with lack of NDF. You're going to have decreased rumen pH. The acids are no longer buffered. That means the pH drops. You're going to have lack of NDF. You're going to have increased acid production. And the acid production in the short run is going to exceed what gets absorbed. So you're going to get an acid buildup in the rumen. And with that acid buildup comes that decreased pH. We tend to look at pH because that's easy to measure and easy to look at, but it's really the amount of acid in there, the osmoles, the amount of potassium, sodium in the rumen, all those components together that are overloading that rumen and making that cow feel bad. So how do we balance our carbohydrates? We got to balance the NSC or NFC against the NDF. So we balance the rumen. We don't want that lack of NDF where we get the big swings in pH that we're going up, we're going down. We want it to stay at like 6.2 all the time. And if we feed our cows right, we mix our rations right, we balance things the way we're supposed to, we should get that. We want to keep that pH above 6. We start to get down below 6, we get into subclinical acidosis. We call that, we're getting down to 5.8. So every time we go on our pH thing, we go from a 6 to a 5. Does anybody know what the change in acid is when we move through pH? Ten times. We go from 7 to 6. We've got 6 is 10 times the acid. 6 to 5, 10 times the acid. So from 7 to 5, we got 100 times the acid load as we had at pH 7. So we want to minimize that. So minimize the swings, balance the rumen as best we can with our carbohydrate in our ration. We want to maximize, for our lactating cows, maximize energy intake. So what is energy intake? Does everybody remember? How do I measure energy intake? Megacalories per day. How do I calculate megacalories per day? How do I calculate any nutrient intake for a given day? How do I determine how many megacalories are going in the cow? Maximize energy intake, maximize megacalories per day. How do I do that? How do I figure out how many megacalories are going into those cows? Dry matter what? Intake. That's one part of it. What's the other part? Times the calorie concentration, megacalories per pound. So I want dry matter intake times megacalories per pound to be as high as I can get it. So I have to balance my dry matter intake and then my energy concentration. Finding out which of those two is going to give me the maximum energy intake. As I lower my calories per pound, I'm going to have to increase my dry matter intake. We're trying to find that top of the curve, remember? Energy intake at the top of the curve, where we've got the right amount of intake and the right concentration of energy to maximize that energy intake. We want to make sure our carbohydrates do what else they're supposed to, which is maintain the rumen and GI health. They need a certain amount of scratch factor to maintain a healthy rumen, stimulate rumination, make sure we don't overdo the acid that rips apart the rumen. And we'll talk about that in A&P, what acidosis does to a cow. It all starts in the rumen. So if we're going to balance, we want to maximize, figure out what our maximum NFC is, non-forage carbohydrate. And we got to balance that with the minimum NDF to keep all the things we need to get done. Making sure we need healthy, make sure we balance those swings. We need a minimum amount of NDF to get that done. And the type of NDF also plays into that. So we're balancing roughly right on paper, and then we make an adjustment by what the cows tell us. There's a whole list of things I should be checking on a regular basis to make sure that I got my carbohydrates where I need them to be. So we're going to check milk fat. We're going to check milk protein. We're going to check those two against each other. So milk fat is usually maximized by a properly balanced carbohydrate mix. A healthy rumen is going to produce more microbial protein. If there's more microbial protein, there's going to be more protein that the cow can give to her calf. Joe's rule number 2, to allow more protein to be passed on to the next generation. So if the rumen is healthy, we're going to get more microbial protein. We check manure consistency. We'll show you how to do that as the semester goes on. Does everybody know the toe test, right? Well, take your foot, dip it in a cow patty and see what happens. If you break your toe, it's too hard. If you slip and fall, it's too loose. You want that shaving cream consistency, what you're looking for. So you stick your toe in, it sticks to your boot. Doesn't slide off or doesn't break your toe. We need the new rumination. If you guys know the rule of thumb, if I mentioned it already for rumination in a group of cows. Standard rule of thumb is 1 and 2. See animals in a pen, half of them should be ruminating. I prefer looking at the animals that are lying down, and of those animals lying down, I want 3 out of 4. So you've had in 160, you've had how a cow spends her day. How does a cow spend her day? What's half of her day? If she's going to do her work, what is half of her day? Laying down. Rumination should be about 9 hours a day. When do they do most of their rumination? Lying down. So if I got 9 out of 12, that's where I get 3/4 from. Anytime I see that 3 out of 4, things are going well on a farm. You also have to think when you're looking at rumination, is this not the most disturbed time of the day? They're going to do most of their rumination at night. Is this dairy challenge and we just had 100 students walk in with plastic boots that they've never been there before? That's not going to promote a lot of rumination. Although the 2 farms we went on Thursday, cows were like, "Hey, how you doing?" So they've had enough visitors up there that they aren't spooked by the rubber boots. Hoof health. Does everybody know how to look at hooves and see, look into the past? Hooves are a record of what she's been doing for the last 9 months. So when we have acidosis, we have poor hoof quality. If we have poor hoof quality, does anybody know what happens? We start to get the Aladdin slippers. If it's constant, right? They get the curled toes. Because the wall can't hold up anymore and it collapses. It can't collapse in, it collapses out. Does everybody know what a hardship groove is? You look at all the cows in a farm and they've all got this horizontal groove on their feet at the same location. You want to really impress a producer, you go, what happened 6 months ago here? How'd you know that? Well, if you look at all the feet, 1.5 inches down for the coronary band, if it grows 1/4 inch a month, everybody's got this deep groove in their hooves. Something bad happened to the entire herd 6 months ago. So what she eats affects hoof quality. So that's a way we can check things. There was a dairy challenge herd a number of years ago that all the cows looked like they were walking on broken glass. They're going out, 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 out. And if you looked at them, those feet were all, toes were all curled up. They must have had acidosis more or less chronically. So they got inflamed lamina or corium in the feet. So anybody's hit their finger with a hammer, right? So we talk about the hoof is like your nail, and then you got the bone on the inside. You got that soft tissue in between the bone and the nail. If that swells up, it hurts. So every step she takes, she goes, ow, 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 ow. They all look like they're walking on broken glass or nails. So how do we relieve that? Anybody do that to you? You hit your finger with a thing, red hot needle, and we relieve that pressure, and everybody feels a lot better. That's what we'll do with our cows, hoof trimming. There's all those online ones with the explosives, right? Everybody, the high view ones are all the ones that explode out from the hoof trimming guys. Gross gets looks, right? And then ruminal pH. This is hard to measure, but it can be done. This is usually done by a vet. You're doing rumiocentesis, or you're doing a hose down the throat and trying to get a rumen fluid sample. There are some real problems with that stuff. Why it's best left to a professional. So these are all ways that cows can tell you you've got your carbohydrates right or you've got your carbohydrates wrong. Yes. Okay, so there are a number of different things in there. You got to make sure you're not sampling near the wall. So you got to be at least that far out. Anybody want to guess why that is? I guess I should ask you because there's no way you're going to get it. But urea comes in. We'll talk about protein. Urea comes in from the wall. As soon as it hits the rumen, the microbes rip it apart and they turn it into two ammonias. Does anybody know what ammonia does to the pH? Anybody here clean with ammonia? Back in the old days, use straight ammonia, right? That's a high pH. So if you've got low pH in the rest of the room and you sample too close to the wall, you get an artificial increase. That's also why if you do rumiocentesis, where you go in through her ribs and go in and try to stick a needle in, you need to get in far enough to get away from the wall to get that away from that artificial high. You need to get into the center. So you're looking like a needle like that. What's the downside of taking that needle out? Going to touch what? It's going to touch the high cell, but you've already pulled your sample into a syringe. If I take that needle out, what do we know about that needle inside the rumen? It's going to make a hole because you pushed it in, but it's covered with bacteria, isn't it? Now you're going to drag it back through the tissues. So those cows always get infected. There's no way to get around that. You're pulling bacteria back through the wound. So they're going to have an abscess on the side when you're done. So that's why we avoid it. Going down the esophagus and trying to sample that way with a hose, you've got all of that bicarb coming down, and that's going to be the majority of your sample. That's also artificially going to be elevated. You want that hose to get beyond the reticulum and into the rumen, and that's hard to do. So we usually use all of these other indirect indicators to say, hey, there's a ruminal pH problem, as opposed to measuring it directly. That makes sense? Everybody understand how we ask our cows? Nice thing about cows is they will never lie to you, which is more than I could say for most humans. That's the thing I like about cows. They don't lie, but they can't speak English either or Spanish. So you have to learn how to read them. You have to learn how to communicate with them as we move forward. So the NRC, they got updated, the dairy NRC, they went through, they got experts from all over the country, and they said, okay, this is the state of our dairy nutritional knowledge at this point. So they redid it in 2021. It's 500 pages. And I've read it. I had the help of some students in advanced nutrition. We went through and did a chapter a week. So they have protein, they have carbohydrates, all that fun stuff. So every chapter is broken up into a different area like we're talking about. So they changed some of the way they do things in NDF. So for the first time, they split up NDF and they got forage NDF, small f in the front, and then non-forage fiber sources that are smaller, heavy, and less effective, as we've talked about. They talk about the physical NDF, the effective NDF versus total NDF. We know not all the NDF a dairy cow consumes is physically effective. It will not stimulate chewing. Another thing they'll talk about is potentially digestible NDF. Which of that NDF can the rumen bugs potentially rip apart versus the stuff that stays in there for 10 days and still doesn't get touched? That's the indigestible NDF. There's a surprising lack of UNDF. Has everybody seen running around the countryside in New York? Undigestible NDF. There's a lot of people that use that in New York. That was surprisingly absent. Those two are roughly equal, but politically, this is the way we're going to say it because I made up this term and I didn't make up this term. So I'm going to use this term because I am more important than you. Sometimes the egos get a little crazy in the PhD world. So if we're thinking about it, we need to think about rates of digestion, rates of passage, and the extent for any particular nutrient. We're going to focus on NDF here. So NDF gets consumed, it goes into the rumen, and it will disappear one of two ways. It'll either be fermented, or it's going to pass through the omasum to the lower tract. And we can't add more NDF until we get rid of the NDF that's currently there. NDF more or less regulates how much a cow can eat. We've already said that, right? 1% a day is about all a cow can eat, 1% of their body weight. And there are certain cows, we look at the super cows, over the years, they have ability to go beyond that 1%. So, but on average, we're looking at 1%. So if we're looking at the total nutrient, we have some that's very readily available either to the microbes or to the cows. Some that they have to work really hard to pull out, bacteria or the microbes. So you've got this range of fermentability, a range of digestibility. The longer it stays in there, the more will be digested or consumed or fermented. And then you've got some that just flat out isn't available to either the cow or the microbes. So this is the extent versus the potentially digestible. So we could get all of this if we left it in there. If that individual particle stays in the rumen long enough, all of that might be accessible or part of the digestible nutrients, digestible energy. This is how far we can go. This is it. We can't touch this stuff. This is going to go through the cow. It's going to end up on a field somewhere. Where we have the amount that's digested and undigested depends on time. How long does it stay in the rumen? So we got all the easy stuff taken care of, some of the hard stuff, and then the feed is pushed out. That's all we're gonna get from that. So that's the digested. What goes down the track, what goes out the back end of the cow is undigested. That undigested by the cow is going to include all of this stuff, the stuff that can't be digested, plus some of the stuff that's hard to digest. Any questions on that?
So what point?
What do you mean? Digested stuff is gone. What you have is the most recent meal is only this much gone. The stuff that's been in there 40, 24, 48 hours is this much gone. So you have each meal is on a different bar. So the longer it stays in there, the more it disappears. So you've got the stuff that's just there. We've only gotten rid of the easy stuff. The stuff that's in there for 48 hours, we're going to get as far as we can. That's our full digested. So we want to keep it in there long enough to get as much out of that nutrient as we can. We'll go over this again when we start again on Wednesday. Give it some thought, bring your questions.
You said 5 to 8 tonight, right?
Yes,
All right.
I will be here or online.
All right, awesome.
Coming back to me.
Rumen, reticulum. Anyway, you face them.
Thinking about office, so I thought it said.
Why can't you be in your office?
Because I forgot my keys.
Like,
They're my other dad.
Well, was it understandable?
Makes me happy.
Why does it make you happy?
That's why.
I am? Okay.